Greetings, friends. I deeply wish that I were with you in person in your beautiful region of the world, eating the wonderful food and visiting some of the best surfing beaches in the world, including Punta Rocas, which I enjoyed so much last time I was in Peru. I hope I can be with you and see some of you soon, but for now I'm glad that during this very difficult season, at least we can connect digitally. My title for this talk is From Philosophy to God. And years ago, if I had seen that title, I would have been very confused. I would have been very skeptical. I would have thought to myself, this doesn't make any sense. I actually would have thought that sounds like an oxymoron, because I thought that faith was only for people who didn't think hard enough. I thought faith had to be blind. I thought you couldn't give reasons for God. I was studying philosophy at the time at Princeton. And I was challenged by two soccer teammates of mine to read the Bible for the first time. I wasn't that interested, but I was always up for a challenge. And so I did begin to read through, but trying to disprove it. And I would cross things out all over the place. I would add things in the margins. That was my starting point. And yet, things changed for me, because as I continued to read through this text, I began to fall in love with the person of Jesus, the way that he carried himself, the way that he treated people. A woman was caught in adultery and the leaders wanted to stone her. Jesus said, "You who are without sin, throw the first stone." And one by one, they all walked away. Jesus said, "Love your enemies and pray for the people who persecute you." Who says things like that? Imagine how different the world would be if we heeded those words today. That's the exact opposite of what we see in culture. And Jesus didn't just say it, he did it. He actually looked down from the cross that he was being killed on, and he said, "Father, forgive them," about the people who were nailing the nails into his hands. I read this and I thought to myself, I have never known a person like this. And I kept reading this book, and soon I realized that Jesus made some very big claims about himself. He claimed to have existed before Abraham, who existed thousands of years ago. He claimed that he could forgive sins, not just sins against himself, but sins in general. He claimed, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die." He was claiming that he was the source of eternal life, that our eternal destiny was going to be based on whether or not we put our trust in him. Who could make a claim like that? He said to have seen him was to have seen God, and that he and God were one and the same. And I'm thinking, who is this guy? And as C.S. Lewis put it, when someone makes claims like that, you only have so many options. Was he just a big liar? Was he mentally ill and he thought these things were true about himself when he was mistaken? Could he actually have been telling the truth? And I kept reading. And I got to the book of Acts, the history of the early church, and I began to come across words that I never expected to see in the Bible. Words like reasoning, examining, explaining, convincing, disputing, debating, persuading, even proving. I read that the Bereans, one people group, were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Not because they had blind faith, but because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. And I kept reading, and I got to 1 Corinthians 15. And here's what I read from the Apostle Paul. "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that is to Peter, "and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, although some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also." This passage confidently claims that there were hundreds of people who were utterly convinced that they were spending time with Jesus after he clearly had been killed. And it says most of whom are still living. almost to dare the hearer. If you don't believe me, go out and ask them for yourself. And I thought, how am I to explain that? How am I to explain that what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus instead resulted in the greatest movement of all time? I later learned that experts agree that this passage, the contents of this passage, were already established and in this form very soon after the actual events. It was passed around the early church, and most people believe that it was in its form within at most 2 to 3 years, and many say within months or even earlier. Even the most adamant critics of Christianity agree. Gerd Ludemann, German New Testament scholar, usually extremely skeptical about the claims of the Bible. Michael Goulder, a British biblical scholar, president of the Birmingham Humanists Association for a time. Robert Funk, an American scholar who was one of the co-founders of the Jesus Seminar, which was famous in the 80s and the 90s for their criticisms of Christianity. Critics of Christianity, and yet all of them agree, and many others, that this creed is incredibly early, and therefore that there were many people who were walking around in Jesus' day utterly convinced that they were spending time with Jesus after he clearly had been killed. So here's the question. What can account for this? What can bridge the gap between the history of Christianity, part 1, Jesus' followers having deserted him when he was arrested, dejected and defeated when this man who they thought was going to be the Messiah, who was supposed to rise to earthly power, who was supposed to rescue the Jewish people from the heavy hand of Rome and reign forever, died. That should have been the end of the movement. And then the history of Christianity, part 3, who saw these very same followers worship Jesus as Lord, insist that he had raised from the dead, and give up their lives rather than deny him. What can account for this? How can we fill that historical gap? That was the question I was asking as I was studying philosophy at Princeton and being challenged by the claims of Christianity. Could it just be a lie? An elaborate conspiracy? Well, people lie when they're getting something out of it, but remember, the Christians of the first century weren't getting something out of this belief. They were being killed for it. Could it have been a hallucination? No. Multiple people don't see the same hallucination, let alone 500 or more at once in different locations, different people, friends and enemies. Could this idea of Jesus rising from the dead have developed as a legend over time? 100 years ago, that's what many people thought. But further study on this passage from 1 Corinthians, the passage that I read to you, it completely undermined that theory. Studies show that it takes about 3 generations for any significant legendary development to work its way into a text. And as I have already shown, this passage dates to so much earlier than that. There was no time for legend to develop. The disciples saw something, and it completely transformed their lives. Jesus had actual that. The only answer that I have encountered that makes sense is that Jesus actually, bodily, miraculously rose from the dead. Before I was a Christian, I just assumed that, of course, there could not be evidence for such a claim. We're talking about a man rising from the dead. I mean, come on. But then I actually looked into it, and I couldn't believe what I found. Richard Swinburne was one of my former colleagues at Oxford University. He is widely considered to be the most influential British philosopher of religion of the last half century. And in 2003, he published a book called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that on the available evidence today, it is 97% probable that Jesus literally, physically, miraculously rose from the dead. Now, he says he understands that we can't be so precise when it comes to such a claim. He likes to work with probability theory. He's just plugging in estimates at each point in the argument. It's not supposed to be an exact number. But nevertheless, the fact that someone of his intellectual credibility can make that claim, make it in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and then ably defend that claim at top academic conferences all around the world speaks to the intellectual credibility of this claim that Jesus did rise. When I was confronted by this evidence at Princeton while I was studying, I arranged meetings with the two top New Testament professors at the time at Princeton. Neither of them were Christians, and I put this to them. I said, this is what I am engaging with. This is the research I'm engaging with, and I'm having trouble understanding how do we get from what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus to the eruption of Christianity? How do you fill that gap between the history of Christianity part 1 and part 3? I see how the resurrection fills it, but if not the resurrection, what is the alternative? And one of them glanced in the direction of a mass hallucination theory. When pressed, did not have anything to defend that theory, and it's a theory that's riddled with problems and has not earned any degree of credibility in the scholarly literature. The other professor told me that as a historian, he simply wasn't interested in the question. There seemed to be this assumption that as soon as we begin to speculate about the miraculous, we are no longer talking about history. And I've never been able to understand why he thought he could just make that assumption rather than following the evidence wherever it led. I came to two very important realizations through those conversations. The first was that just because someone is very smart does not mean that they have robust answers to the deepest questions of life. Intelligence is one thing. Wisdom is something very different. Many people are intelligent. But wisdom is only had if you apply that intelligence to the deepest questions of life. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Where have we come from? Where are we headed? What is the purpose of life? And therefore, how should we live? Many people are intelligent, but just because you're very smart does not mean that you have answers to those most fundamental questions of life. I also learned through those conversations that criticism without alternative is empty. If you say to me, Vince, you have a terrible phone. Vince, you have a horrible phone. How should I respond? I should respond by asking a question. I should say, okay, I'm open to your criticism, but if my phone is no good, what phone do you think I should get instead? If you then reply and say, actually, I've never come across a phone that's better than yours, Vince, your criticism completely dissolves. It's undermined. It doesn't have any weight. Your criticism only has weight if you have given me an alternative which is better than the thing that you are criticizing. And I realized that many people were happy to tell me that the resurrection is ridiculous, and yet they had no alternative to put in its place. And could it really be that despite 2,000 years of historical scholarship and speculation, we are without any, even a single, remotely plausible explanation for the eruption of the greatest movement of all time? Could it have erupted out of nowhere? I realized that my entire philosophical bias against Christianity was based on the assumption that it was too crazy to believe. But a hypothesis is only probable or improbable relative to what alternative hypotheses are out there. A claim is only crazy if there is a less crazy claim that can account for the same data. So now I began to wonder, have I made the same mistake in other areas of inquiry as well? Everything was called into a question, right back to the most fundamental question of all. How do we explain the universe itself? And again, I had just assumed that God was too crazy of an explanation, but I had never taken the time to consider the alternatives. And now for the first time I was realizing that when you think about big picture explanations for the universe, how did all of this get here? There are only so many options. In fact, there are only 3 options. The first one, that God created it. And as a Christian, I'm okay with putting my hand up and saying, you know what? That's an incredible, extraordinary, miraculous option. But let's look at the alternatives. A second alternative. The universe just popped into existence from nothing for no reason whatsoever. Well, that too is an incredible hypothesis. The physical stuff in our everyday lives doesn't generally just pop in and out of existence. If it doesn't now, why should we think that it did then? Or a third option, the universe has always existed, extending infinitely back in time, but again, without any explanation for why that's the case. Well, now maybe you can explain each part of the universe with a part that came before it, but you still have absolutely no explanation for why there is this enormous, intricate, finely tuned universe at all. And that too is absolutely extraordinary. I call this the normalcy of the supernatural. These 3 options exhaust the relevant alternatives, and every single one of them is absolutely extraordinary, way beyond the realm of the ordinary. And even if you decide, you know what, I'm going to remain agnostic because I can see that all 3 of these alternatives are incredible. Well, logically, you are still committed to one of these 3 alternatives being true, and that in itself is just as crazy. The conclusion is that we live in a miraculous world. Whether you are a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic tonight, in this respect, that does not matter. You cannot get around the fact that you have to be committed to believing something which is absolutely extraordinary. I was reminded of this some years back when I was exchanging emails with a friend of mine. He was actually a retired Princeton professor of the history of science, and we were exchanging emails, and I was laying out some of my reasoning for believing in the Christian claims, and he was laying out his objections to the Christian claims. And at the end of a long email, as if to trump all the other arguments, at the end, he simply wrote, "Nor can I believe in a virgin birth." As if to say, it would be crazy to believe in such a thing. And at first, I was daunted by the claim. I began to write an email back, trying to persuade him that maybe he could consider believing in a virgin birth. And then it dawned on me. He already did. In fact, everyone believes in a virgin birth, whether they realize it or not. Now, Christians believe that Jesus, as God himself, was miraculously born of a virgin. Admittedly, that is outside the realm of the ordinary. That's an incredible belief. But again, what exactly is the alternative? Take the brilliant Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking's attempt to propose an atheistic birth of our universe. Here's what he says. He says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. Is that any less miraculous of a birth than Jesus being born of a virgin? That sounds a lot like a virgin birth to me. Or consider the words of the prolific atheist philosopher Quentin Smith, someone with 12 books and over 150 peer-reviewed articles to his name. And here's his best attempt at giving a naturalistic explanation of the universe. He says, the fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being. That definitely sounds like a virgin birth. Again, we're led to the same conclusion. We live in a miraculous world. There is no getting around that fact. It is not a matter of whether we believe in a virgin birth. It is simply a matter of which virgin birth we choose to accept. We can choose to accept the virgin birth of an atheistic universe, which is indifferent to us, a universe where there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, as Richard Dawkins has put it. Or we can believe in the virgin birth of a God who loves us so deeply that he came to be born among us and to live beside us, to call us sons and daughters, family and friends. It's actually the exact opposite of blind, pitiless indifference. Someone who is not blind to anything about you and yet loves you. Someone who knows you in absolute full and yet loves you in absolute full. What an incredible gift. With each fundamental question of life, origin, meaning, morality, destiny, I began to realize that I had removed God, but I had no alternative. I had removed God, but I had put nothing in his place. I had no alternative for the resurrection. I had no alternative for the origin of the universe. And that's bad philosophy. I also had no alternative for morality. At the foundation of any plausible morality is the belief that all people should be treated with dignity and respect and fairness, that all people are equally valuable. But for that to be the case, there has to be something which is equally true about every single person, in virtue of which each person can be equally valuable. What is it? What is the one thing that is equally true of every single person and cannot change and therefore can ground the equal value of every single person? It is surprisingly difficult to answer that question because all of our natural endowments are distributed along a spectrum. Some people are less intelligent than others. Some are less happy, less healthy, less wealthy, less good at passing on their genes, less useful for society. And all of these things, they all change over time. So what is it that is equally true of every single person and completely unchanging? The only answer, I can't think of another alternative, the only answer I can come up with is the love of God. The extravagant, unconditional, no ifs love of God that is for every single person and that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. Christians call it grace, my favorite word. Unmerited love. When my wife Jo and I were still dating, there was a point, she was blinded by love at one point, and she said, "Vince, I don't deserve you." And I responded, "No, you don't." Which is not the recommended response. And thankfully, I didn't stop there. I continued. I said, "No, you don't, and I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful?" How could we ever deserve another person as our very own? Surely that's beyond what any of us could ever merit or deserve. Love at its best is not based on what we earn or what we merit or what we deserve. It is based on grace, and I like that type of love. It's the sort of love that means you don't always need to be looking over your shoulder or around the corner worrying that someone more worthy of love than you is going to come along. It's a love that you can stop competing for and just enjoy. What if, even before the foundation of the world, even before the origin of the universe, God loved every one of us with grace, with love that is a gift, with love that cannot be earned and cannot be lost, with love that is exactly the same on your best day and on your very worst day, with the love of a parent looking down at a newborn child. That child can't do anything to earn the parent's love, and yet that love could not be more extravagant. With the love of a parent who sees a lost son far off on the horizon, Luke 15. It says, while he was still far off, the father sees his son. And this is a son who had done everything wrong. A son who had demanded his inheritance early. It was basically to wish his father dead. Then he had gone off and he had wasted the inheritance on everything he shouldn't have been spending it on. And now his father sees him still far off on the horizon, and he takes off sprinting towards his son. I've always thought of this story from the other perspective. I wonder what it must have looked like to the son who had done everything wrong, who had shamed the family and now saw his father sprinting at him from afar. He must have thought it was more likely that he was going to get hit and rebuked than what actually happened. In fact, he would have known that in that culture, what was supposed to happen to him, a young man who had lost his inheritance to foreigners, was the whole village was supposed to circle around him and yell at him, "He is cut off from his people." And instead, this loving father sprints to his son who had done everything wrong. And he throws himself on his son. and he kisses his son. And he gives his son a ring. He gives him the family ring again to say, you have the authority of the family. He gives him a robe. It would have been the father's own robe, the finest robe. He gives him sandals on his feet to symbolize you are free again. And he yells back to the family and he says, kill the best animal that we have. We're throwing the biggest party you've ever seen because this son of mine who I love so deeply was lost, but now he is found. What if God loves us like that? What if he loves us not with a love that is meant to be earned, but simply with a love that is meant to be returned? That we are loved by God is the one and only thing that can never change about us, and that is equally true of every single one of us. There is no alternative. And that's why I believe that only God gives us our identity, and why only God can ground any plausible morality, which has to be based on the equal value of every single person. My entire journey from skeptic to Christian began because I started to read this book. And eventually I got all the way back towards the end of this book to the book of Hebrews, and I came across a biblical definition of faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And I thought to myself, this is not a God who is asking me to take some blind leap of faith. No, this is a God, yes, who's asking me to love him with all of my heart and all of my soul and all of my strength, but also with all of my mind. And I remember reasoning to myself that if God made me, and if he made me with this mind, then he would want a sincere intellectual search to point in his direction. And ultimately, that is exactly what I found. I was finishing reading a book on the resurrection in my dorm room as a freshman in college at Princeton. I was in 122 Jolene Hall. And as I finished that book and began to close the cover, the conviction of my mind began to align with the conviction that I was feeling in my heart. I was alone in the room, but I exclaimed out loud, "Oh my gosh, this really happened." And I dropped to my knees in that moment, and I prayed a very simple prayer, but I told Jesus that I believed he was who he claimed to be, and I told him that I wanted to trust him in the days ahead with the rest of my life. It was an incredible moment where faith became not blind, not wishful thinking, but the amazing, tangible, daily reality of what really happened. And how incredible that I could become a Christian right then and there, because God wasn't asking me to do things to work my way up to him. He was simply asking me to accept that Jesus had already done everything necessary to come down to me. He wasn't evaluating me based on what sacrifices I had made for him. He was simply asking me to accept and be grateful for the eternal sacrifice that he had already made for me. A while back, I met a woman after I had given a talk somewhere. I told this story about when I put my trust in Jesus. And at the end of this talk, she came down to the front, and she was clearly emotional and had tears on her face. She said to me, "Did you say 122 Jolene Hall, the dorm room?" In which I said, "Yes," to God. I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "Well, I went to Princeton as well, and I'm about 15 years older than you," she said. "But I lived in 121 Jolene Hall. And I spent my 4 years in college praying for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall. All of these years, I've thought that God didn't hear my prayer, that God didn't respond to my prayer, but as I heard you speak, I realized that God had heard my prayer, and he had responded to my prayer literally, word for word, for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall." Now, depending on your belief system, you may think that that's just an incredible coincidence. But if God exists, then it means something very different. Then it means that God is orchestrating our lives to put us in a position to come to know him. Could it be that that is what God is doing in your life right now? Could it be that God is arranging things in your life? Maybe people who prayed for you 15 years ago, leading all the ways up to this talk, to put you in a position not to force you to believe in him, not to manipulate you to believe in him, but to give you good reason to believe in him and to invite you to do so. A friend of mine once said to me, "Vince, do you think that we can know God?" And I responded, "Yeah, sure." But he wasn't satisfied. He pressed back in with urgency. He said, "No." He said, "Do you think that we can really know God?" And he was differentiating between two different types of knowing. G.K. Chesterton made a similar distinction in philosophy as well. We tend to talk about propositional and non-propositional types of knowledge. I can explain it this way. There are two ways to know whether a jacket fits. Okay, one way is I can look at all the measurements. I can look at the measurements of the shoulders and the length of the arms, and I can make an evaluation about whether this jacket fits. But there's another way to know whether the jacket fits. I can pick it up off the rack, and I can try it on. Both are important. For me, in my journey, if I had not looked at the measurements and seen that they were in the vicinity of what I should expect if Christianity were valid, I never would have picked it up and tried it on. But there is no substitute for trying it on. There is no substitute for putting a jacket on and seeing if it fits. You can only know so much about food before you actually take a bite and see how it tastes. You can only know so much about a person before you give up your distance and actually take a step of relational trust towards them. I used to think, once I know all of the answers, once all of my questions have been answered, I've exhausted the evidence, that's when I will take a step of faith towards God. But what I found was that the fullness of the knowledge that I sought was only made possible through an act of personal commitment. When it comes to faith, God does generously invite us to examine all the measurements of philosophy and science and biology and cosmology and everything else. He generously invites us to examine that. But he also says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Clothe yourself in Christ. Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. A question for every one of us. Do you know about God? Or do you know God himself? Have you done some abstract reasoning about God and pursued him with intelligence? Or have you actually encountered him? Do you know his measurements? Or have you actually been willing to take that step of relational trust and try it on? Encounter him, know his voice day to day in the context of your lived life. It is hard to explain that experience of knowing God personally through each day and each moment. But there's one person that I met a while back who he put vivid words to the experience that I have had and that so many Christians around the world have had. He was journeying through a week of talks and research and investigation. He had checked the measurements. He was analyzing the measurements. He was seeing that they were pointing in the direction of Jesus. But then he came to that point where if he wanted to know more, he was going to have to take some sort of step of relational trust. And he did that. He did that by bowing his head and praying a very simple prayer, but a prayer that said, Jesus, if you are there, I would like to know you. Not just about you, but I would like to know you. And it was this beautiful, simple prayer of saying, I want to trust you. And when he opened his eyes from that prayer, these were the very first words that came out of his mouth. I'll always remember them. He said, I have always felt alone and like I had to wear a mask. But now this is the first time in my life that I can take off that mask and be fully myself and fully alive. No philosophy can do that. No religion can do that. But Jesus can. That is the offer on the table for every single one of us, not just to know about God, but to know God himself. The God who, yes, invites us into the philosophical, but also invites us beyond the philosophical to the personal. The God who invites us to take off whatever mask we might be wearing and to be fully ourselves and fully alive. Okay, that is my prayer for you, and maybe that is only a prayer away. The testimony of the young man I just spoke of, my own testimony and the testimony of countless others, is that we consider the measurements. We take philosophy seriously. If God had made me with this mind, then he would want an intellectual search to point in his direction. But he doesn't just want us to know him philosophically. He doesn't just want us to know him scientifically. He doesn't just want to be part of our abstract reasoning. He wants to be part concretely of our day-to-day lives. That's why he came down concretely in the flesh, lived a life he didn't have to live, died a death that he did not have to die, so that we could know him not just philosophically, but personally. And my prayer for you is that even as you seek him with your mind, that you would find as you do that he is actually the one who is seeking you, because he has that grace, love for you, whatever you have done, whatever you have thought, whatever you have said, his love is unchanged. And if you will open yourself to him, he will take off running like that embarrassing father who sees his son on the lost horizon and reaches him and embraces him and welcomes him home. May God bless you.